There comes a moment in every super empath's life when silence replaces love. Not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started listening. Listening to the exhaustion in their soul. Listening to the quiet voice that says, "This is costing you more than it's giving." And that moment is not weakness, it is wisdom. You see, the super empath doesn't walk away easily. They stay, they explain, they forgive. They see potential where others see problems. They love deeply, spiritually, instinctively. They believe that if they just show enough patience, enough understanding, enough compassion, love will eventually land where it's meant to. But here is the divine truth. Love is not meant to be proven through suffering. When silence enters the relationship, it is not a punishment. It is a revelation. It is the soul saying, "I have spoken enough." Silence is what happens when words have been ignored, when emotional bids have gone unanswered, when love has been offered without reciprocity. And for the avoidant, this silence feels sudden. But it isn't. It has been building quietly for a long time. The avoidant often believes distance equals safety. They confuse independence with emotional withdrawal. They fear being seen too deeply because being seen requires responsibility. Responsibility for how their actions affect someone who feels everything. And when faced with that depth, they retreat. Not because they don't care, but because caring demands courage. The super empath eventually realizes something life-changing. Love should not require constant self-abandonment. Love should not make you shrink, over-explain, or doubt your worth. Real love meets you halfway. It doesn't disappear when things get real. It doesn't go quiet when vulnerability shows up. And this is where the shift happens. The empath stops chasing clarity and starts choosing peace. They stop asking for effort and start embodying boundaries. They stop explaining their value and start honoring it. Silence becomes an act of self-respect, a sacred pause, a closing of a door that was never meant to stay open at the cost of their spirit. This silence carries a message the avoidant never expected. I loved you, but I love myself more. And that truth is confronting because for the first time, the empath is no longer available to absorb confusion, inconsistency, or emotional absence. They are no longer waiting. They are becoming. Divine principles teach us that love flows. It doesn't beg. What is meant for you will not require you to abandon your intuition. What is aligned will not drain you. When silence replaces love, it is often because love has evolved into wisdom. And here is the final truth the super empath leaves behind. Not spoken, but deeply felt. I was never asking for perfection. I was asking for presence. When that presence could not be met, silence became the most loving choice of all. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing, and walk forward in truth. Silence is often misunderstood as emptiness, as a lack of feeling or a withdrawal of care, but in truth, silence is one of the loudest forms of communication we will ever encounter. When silence replaces love, it is not because emotions have vanished, it is because they have finally been acknowledged at a deeper level. Silence arrives when words have been exhausted, when explanations have been repeated without being received, and when emotional truths have been dismissed for too long. It is the moment when the heart realizes that speaking louder will not create understanding, and that continuing to talk may actually betray one's own self-respect. For the super empath, silence does not come easily. This is someone whose instinct is to express, to clarify, to heal through conversation. They believe in emotional transparency, in meeting problems with dialogue, and in offering reassurance even when it is not returned. So when silence finally appears, it is not impulsive, it is deliberate. It is the result of countless internal negotiations where the empath asks themselves, how much more of myself can I give before I lose who I am? Silence becomes the final language of truth when every other language has failed. What makes silence so powerful is that it removes illusion. Words can be manipulated, intentions can be promised, and emotions can be explained away, but silence exposes reality. It shows where effort ends. It reveals who is willing to meet emotional depth and who is only comfortable skimming the surface. For the avoidant, silence can feel confusing, even cruel, because they are accustomed to emotional distance being normalized. But the empath's silence is not distance, it is clarity. It is the moment they stop participating in a dynamic that requires them to overextend while receiving less and less in return. Silence also forces reflection. When someone no longer explains their pain, no longer asks to be chosen, no longer fights to be understood, the space left behind becomes confronting. It asks questions without speaking them. Why did it take silence for me to notice their value? Why did I feel safest when they were doing all the emotional work? These questions arise not because the empath wants to punish, but because silence creates a mirror. And mirrors do not accuse, they simply show. On a deeper level, silence is the soul's boundary. It is a divine pause that says, I will no longer abandon myself to keep this connection alive. In spiritual terms, silence is alignment. It is choosing inner peace over external validation. It is trusting that what is meant to meet you will not require you to shout to be seen. The empath learns that constantly explaining their needs is not noble, it is exhausting. Silence becomes the space where they reclaim their energy, their intuition, and their sense of worth. Importantly, silence does not mean the absence of love. It often means love has transformed. It has matured from attachment into self-honoring wisdom. The empath may still care deeply, but they no longer confuse care with access. They understand that love without mutual presence becomes self-betrayal. Silence is how they protect what is sacred within them when words are no longer safe to offer. In the end, silence communicates a truth that words never could. I have listened to myself and I choose peace. That truth does not shout, demand, or persuade. It simply exists. And for those willing to hear it, silence speaks louder than love ever did. The super empath loves in a way that is instinctive, generous, and deeply human. Their heart opens not as a strategy, but as a reflex. They feel others before they think about themselves, sensing emotional shifts, unspoken pain, and unmet needs with remarkable clarity. Giving love comes naturally to them, and for a long time, they believe this gift is meant to heal, to bridge gaps, and to soften walls. They pour empathy, patience, and understanding into relationships, often without keeping score, because love to them is an expression of who they are, not a transaction. But this same gift becomes a lesson when love is given. Without boundaries. The super empath often learns too late that emotional generosity, when unprotected, can become self-erasure. They may excuse inconsistency, tolerate distance, and rationalize emotional absence because they understand the wounds behind it. They see the fear beneath avoidance and the insecurity beneath withdrawal. In doing so, they begin to prioritize the other person's emotional comfort over their own emotional safety. This is where love, meant to be expansive, quietly turns into sacrifice. The turning point comes when the empath realizes that understanding someone does not require abandoning oneself. Compassion does not mean endurance without limits. There is a profound difference between being patient and being unavailable to yourself. The super empath eventually feels the cost of constant giving, emotional fatigue, self-doubt, and a shrinking sense of worth. They start to notice that while they are deeply attuned to the other person's needs, their own needs remain unanswered. Love in this form becomes unbalanced, and the soul begins to resist. Self-respect enters not as anger, but as awakening. It is the quiet realization that love should not require convincing, chasing, or proving. The empath understands that while their capacity to love deeply is sacred, it must be matched with discernment. Giving love freely does not mean giving it endlessly to someone who cannot receive it. Self-respect teaches them that their empathy is not an obligation others are re-entitled to. It is a privilege earned through mutual care. As this awareness grows, the super empath learns to differentiate between being kind and being self-neglectful. They begin to ask new questions. Do I feel safe here? Do I feel seen? Do I feel valued without having to perform emotional labor? These questions are not selfish, they are grounding. They anchor the empath back into their own body, their own truth. Self-respect becomes the filter through which love flows, ensuring that what they give does not drain them of who they are. This shift can feel uncomfortable at first, especially for someone who has equated love with self-sacrifice. Setting boundaries may feel like withholding, but in truth, it is honoring. The empath discovers that real love expands both people. It does not leave one person emotionally depleted while the other remains protected. Self-respect allows the empath to step back, not to punish, but to preserve their integrity. Ultimately, the super empath learns that loving others well begins with loving themselves responsibly. Their depth was never the problem, the absence of boundaries was. When self-respect takes its rightful place, love becomes healthier, clearer, and more aligned. What they offer then is not desperation or overgiving, but grounded, intentional presence. And in that space, love finally reflects the value they have always carried within. Avoidant behavior is often misunderstood as indifference or emotional coldness, but at its core, it is rarely about a lack of love. More often, it is rooted in fear. Fear of intimacy, fear of being depended on, and fear of the emotional accountability that comes with true closeness. The avoidant may feel deeply, but they experience those feelings as overwhelming rather than nourishing. Love, instead of feeling safe, feels like a threat to their autonomy, their control, or their emotional equilibrium. For the avoidant, intimacy triggers an internal conflict. On one side, there is a desire for connection, affection, and being chosen. On the other, there is an ingrained belief that closeness leads to loss of independence, loss of self, or loss through eventual rejection. This creates a push-pull dynamic where they may pursue initially, then retreat once emotional depth begins to form. Their withdrawal is not a calculated rejection of the other person, but a reflexive attempt to regulate discomfort they do not fully understand or know how to articulate. Emotional accountability is particularly challenging for the avoidant. Being emotionally accountable means acknowledging how one's actions impact another person, especially someone who is sensitive and emotionally attuned. It requires presence, consistency, and the willingness to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this level of emotional responsibility can feel suffocating. Rather than face the vulnerability required to stay engaged, they unconsciously choose distance as a form of self-protection. This is why the avoidant often minimizes, deflects, or rationalizes emotional needs, both their own and those of their partner. They may frame closeness as too much, emotional conversations as unnecessary, or dependency as weakness. These narratives are not truths, they are coping mechanisms. They allow the avoidant to maintain a sense of safety without having to confront the deeper fear that intimacy will expose parts of them they have long kept guarded. When paired with a super empath, this dynamic becomes especially pronounced. The empath senses the avoidant's fear and often responds with increased understanding, patience, and emotional availability. Unfortunately, this can unintentionally reinforce the imbalance. The more the empath leans in, the more the avoidant feels pressured to show up in ways they are not yet equipped to handle. Love exists, but it is filtered through fear, creating confusion for both people. The tragedy is that the avoidant's fear of intimacy often prevents them from experiencing the very connection they crave. They want love, but only in doses they can control. They desire closeness, but without the vulnerability that sustains it. As a result, relationships may remain emotionally incomplete, full of potential, but lacking the depth that comes from mutual presence and accountability. Understanding this truth does not excuse the pain caused by avoidant behavior, but it does reframe it. The empath eventually realizes that no amount of love, reassurance, or patience can heal someone who is unwilling to face their own fear. Avoidance is not cured by being loved harder. It is healed through self-awareness and courageous emotional work. In this realization, clarity replaces confusion. The empath understands that the issue was never their depth or their needs. It was the avoidant's fear of meeting them there. Love without accountability cannot sustain intimacy, and connection without courage cannot grow. This truth, once seen, changes everything. When love is met with distance, the instinct for many is to move closer, to try harder, to prove devotion through increased effort. For the super empath, this response feels almost automatic. They believe that consistency, reassurance, and emotional availability will eventually dissolve walls. They double down on communication, offer more understanding, and give the benefit of the doubt repeatedly. But over time, this well-intentioned pursuit begins to teach a painful lesson. Effort alone cannot create connection when the other person is not moving toward you. Distance in a relationship is information. It is not an invitation to overextend. It is a signal to pause and observe. When someone consistently withdraws, delays, or emotionally disappears, chasing them often reinforces the imbalance. The more one person pursues, the less the other feels compelled to show up. This dynamic subtly trains both individuals. The pursuer learns to abandon themselves, while the avoidant learns that distance carries no consequence. What begins as love gradually turns into a one-sided emotional labor. Standing firmer does not mean becoming cold or indifferent. It means remaining rooted in self-respect. It means recognizing that your presence is valuable and should not be treated as optional. When the empath learns to stop chasing, they are not withholding love. They are restoring balance. They shift from asking, "How can I make this work?" to asking, "Is this working for me?" This internal reorientation is powerful because it places responsibility back where it belongs, on both people. There is a quiet strength in choosing not to pursue what consistently retreats. Standing firm requires tolerating discomfort, the discomfort of uncertainty, of missing someone, of resisting the urge to explain or fix. But this discomfort is temporary, while the cost of constant chasing is cumulative. Every time you override your intuition to maintain connection, you teach yourself that your needs are secondary. Standing firm interrupts that pattern and reestablishes self-trust. For the avoidant, this firmness can be unsettling. They are accustomed to being pursued, to having space without consequence. When that pursuit stops, they are confronted with the reality of their own behavior. Sometimes this creates growth, sometimes it creates distance. Either outcome brings clarity. Standing firm removes ambiguity and reveals whether the connection was sustained by mutual desire or by one person's relentless effort. Importantly, standing firm is not an ultimatum or a test. It is an internal boundary. It is the decision to no longer chase emotional availability that is inconsistently offered. The empath learns that love should feel reciprocal, not performative. They stop negotiating their worth through effort and allow actions, not promises, to speak. This shift also reconnects the empath to their own power. Instead of reacting to withdrawal, they respond from alignment. They choose consistency over intensity, presence over potential. Standing firm becomes an act of self-leadership, signaling to the nervous system that safety comes from self-honoring, not external validation. Ultimately, when love is met with distance, the lesson is not to run after what pulls away. It is to remain grounded, open, and self-respecting. What is meant to meet you will step forward when you stop chasing, and what cannot meet you where you stand reveals itself without you having to pursue it any further. There is a profound moment in the super empath's journey when they realize that the end of emotional availability is not a loss, but a return. For so long, their sense of purpose may have been intertwined with being needed, being understanding, and being the emotional anchor for someone else. When they finally withdraw that availability, it can feel unfamiliar, even frightening, as though they are betraying the very qualities that define them. Yet beneath that fear lies a powerful truth. Reclaiming oneself is not abandonment, it is alignment. Emotional availability, when given without boundaries, slowly fragments the self. The empath becomes externally oriented, constantly attuned to another person's moods, needs, and silences. Their inner world grows quieter, not because there is peace, but because there is neglect. When they stop making themselves endlessly accessible, they create space to hear their own emotional voice again. This space marks the beginning of self-reclamation, where attention shifts from managing the relationship to nurturing the self. Withdrawing emotional availability does not mean becoming closed-hearted. It means becoming intentional. The empath learns that not everyone deserves access to their inner world. Availability becomes something sacred, offered where there is safety, reciprocity, and respect. This discernment is transformative. It allows the empath to reconnect with their values, desires, and sense of identity beyond the role they played in someone else's healing or avoidance. Inner alignment begins when actions match truth. For the empath, truth often whispers long before it is acted upon. There were moments of discomfort, intuitive nudges, and emotional exhaustion that signaled misalignment. Ending emotional availability is the act of finally honoring those signals. It is choosing congruence over hope, reality over fantasy. Alignment brings relief because it removes the constant internal conflict between what is felt and what is tolerated. As this alignment deepens, the empath's energy changes. They no longer feel scattered or depleted. Their nervous system begins to settle, no longer braced for emotional inconsistency. This regulated state opens the door to clarity. They see past dynamics with compassion, but without self-blame. They recognize that their empathy was never the problem, it was simply misdirected. Emotional availability, once freely given to someone who could not meet it, is now redirected inward. Self-reclamation also restores personal power. The empath realizes they are not responsible for another person's readiness, healing, or growth. By stepping back, they release the illusion of control and accept what is. This acceptance is not passive, it is grounded. It allows them to invest in their own expansion, creative pursuits, spiritual growth, meaningful connections, without the constant pull of unresolved attachment. This phase can feel quiet, even lonely, but it is deeply fertile. In the absence of emotional overextension, the empath meets themselves fully. They rediscover joy that is not contingent on someone else's presence, validation, or effort. Inner alignment brings a sense of wholeness that was previously sought through connection. The empath becomes centered rather than stretched thin. Ultimately, the end of emotional availability marks the beginning of a new relationship with the self, one built on honesty, respect, and balance. From this place, future connections are no longer about filling a void, but about sharing abundance. Alignment ensures that love, when offered again, will enhance rather than diminish, and in reclaiming themselves, the empath steps into a version of life that feels grounded, authentic, and whole. Silence becomes sacred when it is used to protect peace, boundaries, and personal worth. For the super empath, silence is not simply a lack of words. It is a conscious choice, a deliberate act of self-preservation, and a statement of inner authority. Throughout their lives, they have felt deeply, given endlessly, and often endured emotional imbalance in the name of love. But when the empath finally chooses silence, it is because they have recognized that their energy, attention, and emotional labor are valuable commodities that must be safeguarded. The sacredness of silence lies in its ability to create space, space to reflect, space to heal, and space to recenter. Words, while powerful, can also bind the empath to dynamics that no longer serve them. Every explanation offered, every reassurance given, and every compromise made at the expense of one's well-being chips away at their sense of self. Silence interrupts this cycle. It is a pause, a protective barrier, and a means to reclaim clarity without confrontation. In choosing silence, the empath signals both to themselves and to the other person that their inner peace is non-negotiable. Boundaries are intimately tied to this silence. A super empath often struggles with saying no because their natural inclination is to meet needs, soothe emotions, and maintain harmony. However, silence becomes a powerful boundary tool, one that communicates limits without aggression. It says, I will no longer engage in energy exchanges that drain me. I will no longer explain myself to those unwilling to listen. In this way, silence acts as a guardian of emotional integrity. It reinforces self-respect and discourages behaviors that are harmful or dismissive. Protecting personal worth is another essential aspect of silence. For too long, the empath may have allowed themselves to feel diminished, unseen, or taken for granted. Words can be ignored, minimized, or misinterpreted, but silence is undeniable. When the empath steps back and stops explaining, persuading, or validating the other person, they assert that their worth is inherent and cannot be negotiated. The absence of over-communication creates a mirror for the avoidant, revealing the cost of their emotional absence in a way that words could never convey. Silence also has a profound internal function. It encourages the empath to turn inward, to examine their own feelings, and to cultivate self-compassion. It is during these quiet moments that they begin to reconnect with their intuition, clarify their values, and assess what they truly desire from relationships. This inner alignment strengthens resilience and fosters a deeper sense of emotional independence. In other words, silence is not emptiness, it is empowerment. It allows the empath to inhabit their own energy fully and without apology. Moreover, silence communicates truths that words cannot. In relationships with avoidance, attempts to explain feelings or motivate change often go unheeded. Silence, however, has a gravity that compels reflection. It is a form of communication that transcends dialogue, showing the impact of absence, the weight of unreciprocated care, and the necessity of mutual engagement. For the avoidant, this silence can be confronting, but it also has the potential to inspire awareness and self-reflection. Ultimately, the sacredness of silence lies in its dual role. It is both a shield and a teacher. It protects the empath from further depletion, while simultaneously imparting a lesson about respect, boundaries, and the non-negotiable value of self-care. By embracing silence, the super empath reclaims power over their emotional world, refusing to compromise their inner peace for the sake of someone else's comfort. It is a quiet but profound declaration: I will honor myself, and in doing so, I invite only what aligns with my truth to remain. The final truth the super empath discovers is that love should feel safe, mutual, and expansive. It should not be confusing, diminishing, or one-sided. For so long, they may have believed that love was defined by endurance, sacrifice, or relentless effort. They equated patience with devotion and overgiving with worthiness. But over time, experience and reflection reveal that genuine love carries with it an inherent sense of safety and reciprocity. Love T. Hat leaves the empath anxious, second-guessing, or exhausted is not aligned with their soul's truth. It is a signal that something essential is missing. Safety in love is the foundation upon which all other aspects of a healthy relationship are built. When the empath is with someone who honors them, they do not have to constantly navigate fear or uncertainty. They can express feelings without anticipating judgment, ask for needs without hesitation, and be fully themselves without pretense. Emotional safety is not a luxury. It is a basic human requirement. Without it, love becomes an exercise in emotional gymnastics, where the empath bends themselves in ways that compromise their integrity, health, and sense of self. Mutuality is equally critical. The super empath learns that love is not meant to be a solo effort. Relationships thrive when both people contribute, invest, and respond to each other's needs. When the empath gives more than they receive or consistently accommodates without reciprocation, the imbalance erodes self-esteem and fosters resentment. True love requires reciprocity, a willingness to meet halfway, to hold space for one another, and to honor both emotional needs. Without mutuality, connection becomes transactional rather than transformative, and intimacy cannot flourish. Love must also be expansive. For the empath, expansive love uplifts, nourishes, and grows both individuals. It does not confine, manipulate, or diminish. Expansive love encourages authenticity, fosters personal growth, and amplifies the sense of joy, purpose, and connection in life. In such love, both partners feel inspired to become the highest versions of themselves. Conversely, love that is restrictive, draining, or confusing contracts the soul, creating stress, fear, and self-doubt. The super empath eventually realizes that their role is not to shrink to fit another's comfort, but to participate in love that magnifies life and vitality. Confusion is a key signal that love is not aligned. When a relationship constantly triggers doubt, anxiety, or uncertainty, the empath's intuition, the very faculty that guided them to understand emotional depth, warns them. The final truth becomes clear. Love that makes you question your worth, wonder about intentions, or feel unseen is not love in its pure form. It may be attachment, dependency, or projection, but it is not the safe, mutual, expansive connection that honors the heart's fullness. Diminishment, too, is unacceptable. Super empaths often attract partners who are emotionally avoidant, inconsistent, or self-centered. While the empath gives generously, the avoidant's withdrawal can silently communicate that the empath's value is negotiable. Over time, this creates a subtle erosion of self-worth. The truth that emerges is that love should never ask a person to minimize themselves in order to maintain connection. Love should celebrate who you are, not demand compromise of the very essence of your being. Finally, the super empath learns that this truth is liberating. It reframes the way they engage with relationships, helping them stop chasing unreciprocated love or clinging to the illusion of potential. It allows them to honor their needs and instincts while still holding compassion for others. Love, when aligned, becomes not a burden, but a mirror of inner abundance, a reflection of the value, dignity, and worth that already exists within. Understanding this final truth frees the empath to seek connections that uplift, sustain, and honor the heart without compromise, guiding them toward relationships that truly resonate with the soul's deepest longing. Thank you for sharing your time and energy with me today. Your presence made this conversation meaningful. Wishing you clarity, strength, and peace on your journey. Goodbye and take care.